Hello, and week 27 of history is on the way. Only one more week after this, but who's counting? We got some pretty big stuff we're going to be covering today. The first lesson is an event that we've kind of hinted at with a couple of other things we've talked about in the past couple of weeks, and it's the Glorious Revolution of England, year 1688. We've talked about what led up to this, and we're going to see about a very significant change in not only British history, but also, you could say, in American history, because a lot of the pressures that led to the Glorious Revolution were also played out in the colonies to a different degree, but they, as you will see, very heavily influenced the way this new nation would eventually be a new nation, the way they would do government. The Glorious Revolution, of course, followed a very tumultuous 60-year period in English history, and we've talked about it, starting with the death of Queen Elizabeth and the end of the Tudor line of monarchs. We started the Stuart line with Charles I, and under Charles I, we saw the English Civil Wars. Basically, about a dozen years of fighting between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. Cavaliers support the king, Roundheads support the Parliament, and of course you remember what happened to Charles I. He was eventually beheaded and replaced with Oliver Cromwell, not a king, but the Lord Protectorate of England. Well, when Cromwell passed, they decided to restore the monarchy, the English Restoration, and they replaced Charles I with his son, Charles II, who was very much a Catholic and a Catholic sympathizer. Cromwell, you remember, was very Protestant and committed atrocities against Ireland because of their support of the Cavaliers during the English Civil Wars. So Charles II takes the throne from his dad, and he proceeds to pretty much put in the same anti-Protestant policies. In particular, he had problems with the Scottish Covenanters and authorized basically discrimination and oppression against them. His replacement, King James II, took it a step further. Again, Charles I, the one who was beheaded, was more or less hung out to dry by Protestants in Scotland, and so Charles II and James I really did not like the presbyters of Scotland and wanted to get revenge, so they really had, it was the killing times under James II, where Scottish Covenanters were basically hunted down like animals and killed. So in that backdrop, England found themselves once again falling under the grips of an absolute monarch. James II, another one of those, really in love with the idea of the divine right of kings. The king can do no wrong, etc. James, again, being a strong Catholic, was closely aligned with France, who had a Catholic king, Louis the XIV at this time. But England, while all this was going on, while the monarchs were Catholic, England as a nation was growing steadily more Protestant. And so there's friction. The people are headed one way, the monarchy's another way. Something was going to have to give. Now, James II, on the surface, promoted religious tolerance, but he declared had the Declaration of Indulgence, which allowed freedom of religion to Catholics, but he was not as bad on the Quakers and the Puritans as some other Protestant dissenters. Well, James was ending the killing times in Scotland, and a lot of people thought that he was trying to do too much. His fatal mistake might have came when he moved without Parliament's consent. He basically tried to put in these policies, far-sweeping policies, without getting the blessing of Parliament, which was, again, the English had gone through great pains to try to rein in what a king can and cannot do. He didn't arrest members of the Parliament or dissolve the Parliament like his dad did, but he did act apart from Parliament, and it turned out to be a grave mistake. The Declaration of Indulgence was sent to every Anglican pulpit in England. Again, that's the Church of England. Bishops who refused to read it out loud were arrested, and James, and of course, the suspicion is if he's acting without Parliament now, what will he do in the future? And again, he had a son for the longest time. This is a big deal. For the longest time, it was assumed that Mary, his niece, would replace James when he died. Mary was a Protestant, so Protestant England thought that was a good idea. Well, James went and had a son, and he was baptized Catholic. So now, when James II died, England was going to have another Catholic king, another Stuart king. Well, the two political parties that emerged during this era, that is, political factions, called the Whigs and the Tories. We'll talk more about them in a second. They met at a secret room in London, called themselves the Green Ribbon Club. They were trying to come up with a way to prevent England from having another generation of the rule of a Catholic king, particularly a Catholic king that paid no attention to Parliament, that did their own thing. In their pursuit of liberty, they were called liberals. And, of course, for years, that was what liberalism focused on, liberty. Of course, in the modern political context, liberal has a different meaning. But anyway, the Scottish Covenanters, remember them? They became the Whigs for the way they called their horses. They were big on that. But there was another political party that rose up, the Tories. Their motto was the king, the church, and the land. They were much more loyal to the king than the Whigs were. They believed in a strong central government. Anyway, these political factions are forming in England, sort of extra royalty, have very little to do with the king. Now, James was putting Catholics in very powerful positions in the British government, even though he was ostensibly trying to get more religious freedom. Again, Mary was actually his daughter from his first marriage. I think I called her a niece earlier. It was James II's daughter, but it was from a previous marriage. But again, when in 1688, when James's second wife gave birth to a son, everyone knew the next king was going to be Catholic. Catholic of England's obviously pretty excited about this. And it caused the members of these two political factions to get together and to take a very big risk. What they were about to do was treason. They got together behind the king's back and decided to invite his daughter Mary and her husband William to be the king and queen of England. Problem was, you already had a king. So yes, what they did was very treasonous. Now, Mary, again, was married to William of Orange, who was a ruler in the Netherlands. Of course, the English and the Netherlands had their issues before. But you have to think about this awkward situation, I guess. Mary was being invited to take the throne of her father, while her father was still very much alive. But she agreed to it. Her husband William was eager for the arrangement as long as he was named equal ruler to Mary. And the Brits, who again had queens before ruling, had no issue with that. So, go women, I guess. Really moving on up here in terms of where women were regarded during human history. It was a caveat, though. Parliament said, you can come here and we will support you as king and queen, but you have to agree to this very specific list of things that you can and cannot do, called the English Bill of Rights. Stop me if you've heard this before. Basically, the bill stated the king could not override the laws of the land. Parliament was in charge of approving monies used by the king. It also guaranteed freedom of speech and required Parliament to meet often, and it abolished the very notion of the divine right of kings. William and his army landed on the coast of England in November of 1688. James was anticipating this and drawing up an army to challenge them, but a funny thing happened. A lot of his own men refused to defend him. A whole lot of people defected immediately to William's army. Now, William's army was very small, was probably not going to be able to defeat James's army, but James's army started getting a lot smaller, and William started to get a lot bigger. James read the writing on the wall. He fled to France, where his distant cousin, Louis XIV, was king. And in February of 1689, William and Mary were crowned King and Queen of England without a drop of blood being shed. That's one of the reasons it's called the Glorious Revolution. It was bloodless. Nobody died. Now, James later rallied troops in Ireland to try to retake the throne. He actually landed troops on mainland England and was defeated at the Battle of Boyne. And he returned to France and remained exiled the rest of his life. Stuarts, though, would try for the next 60 years to reclaim the throne of England. And it led to some very bloody consequences. The Battle of Culloden in 1746, where the Scottish clans were routed by the British Army, and the clan culture in Scotland was pretty much wiped out. These were Catholic Scots, mainly. And so, yeah, the whole Stuart effort to resume their rule on the throne of England was dead. As for William and Mary, they served England pretty well. They established cabinets to advise the king and queen on issues. William was he was not Catholic. He was actually a Calvinist. Could barely speak English, oddly enough. But they maintained the Anglican Church of England. Again, that compromised church, which is now becoming more Protestant. It's starting to move away from some of the Catholic imagery and whatnot. In 1690, they reinstated the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, but it was not, here's the key, it was not mandatory to be a member of any of the churches of England or Scotland. For the first time in English history, you didn't have to be a church member. So, progress in terms of individual liberty, certainly. Now, William did place limits on the Jewish population of England, which there are very few Jews in England at the time, still are. I mean, for centuries, they were not even allowed in England. He was harsh towards Irish Catholics who had backed James II, but otherwise, the reign of William and Mary was fairly prosperous for England and at large, but it's called the Glorious Revolution because they achieved it without anybody dying. We're going to talk a little philosophy here. We're going to talk about a gentleman named John Locke. He wrote some very important works defending the Glorious Revolution. A couple of his works we'll look at today. He wrote a piece called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding and the Second Treatise of Government. It would have a great influence on England, but also, as you hear some of the words he said, they'll sound familiar because they helped shape the American Revolution and the formation of the American government. John Locke was actually more than just a philosopher. He had a medical degree, was evidently a very accomplished doctor for his time, but he was really passionate about politics, very much an anti-monarch. He did not like the idea of divine right of kings. And John Locke started writing things for the Whig Party. Remember, the Whigs were the ones who, opposed total monarchy. Matter of fact, while he was writing it, of course, James II was on the throne, and the heat got a little too much, and Locke fled to France for a few years to let to the Netherlands also, to let the heat die down, because he thought he was going to be arrested, which almost certainly was. He returned to England, and about the same time, on the very same ship that brought William and Mary to the British mainland. And he began writing essays after the Glorious Revolution to not just justify what had happened, but to give a philosophical foundation for this pretty significant change in English history. In his book about human understanding, he tried to explain how man understands life. According to Locke, men and women are born with minds that are blank slates, tabula rasa, to use the Latin term, and that slate is written on by our experiences, and like pages in a book filled with our senses. This is the concept of empiricism. That's the school of thought that man is mostly shaped by experiences. You are what happens to you, or what you experience. And that new ideas are nothing more than just associations of old ideas. Okay? Empirists say that knowledge is perception plus reflection. Perceiving something and reflecting on it, and that's your reality. And underscoring all this, Locke writes, quote, "Reason must be our last judge and guide in everything." Now, some of the critiques of Locke came from those who were fairly devout Christians, who argued that because man is created in the image of God, the mind at first is not a blank slate, that God has written some things on there. But basically, Locke's philosophies really caught on. He was to philosophy what Newton was to science. It sparked the idea of liberal thought, which, again, means something very different than it does today. And secularism. Despite his push for secularism, Locke was a Christian. In his second treatise of government, he went a little deeper. He starts referring to what he calls man's natural rights. He believed it was natural for a man to protect his life, liberty, and property. That is a natural right, according to Locke. He called these rights, stop me if you've heard this word before, inalienable. You probably heard that word before. It means you've read the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote, did Locke, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Locke expanded on that by saying, in man's natural state, he cannot be completely safe because there's no one in charge. And through that, he concludes that governments are necessary to create laws that protect life, liberty, and property. Where there's no law, there's no freedom, Locke says. He also points out it's, in his opinion, man's duty to obey the government that seeks to protect him. He came up with the concept of a social contract, an unwritten agreement whereby we, as citizens of a free society or a working society, agree to certain restrictions or certain other things in exchange for a civil society. When a man or a woman breaks the social contract, failing to follow the law, a consequence has to follow. They're removed from society, of course, put in jail, maybe a fine to pay. But what happens when the government fails to keep its end of the social contract? Well, that's where Locke's theory faces questions from people like me. It seems to be a one-sided agreement. Also, I'm going to get a little philosophical to you here. The social contract implies what's called tacit consent. That is to say, by living in this country, you agree to live under all of its laws, and if you don't, you'll be punished. Well, my question is, how is consent possible where the withholding of consent is impossible? You don't get a chance to say, no, I don't agree with that. So, again, that's one of the philosophical issues I have with Locke. You don't have to know that. That's a me thing, okay? But I just wanted to just throw that out there for you to ruminate on. These are important things to think about. They are crucial things to think about as you guys are growing up in a nation that was very much formed according to Locke's ideas and ideals. When government failed to uphold its end of the contract, Locke eventually came to conclude that it was the right of the people to overthrow the government. You hear him trying to defend the Glorious Revolution? In his estimation, James II, through his actions, violated that social contract. Therefore, the people were not only justified, but obligated to overthrow the government. He believed that Charles I, Charles II, James II all failed as absolute monarchs to protect these inalienable rights of English people. Now, this is not uniquely a Locke creation. Aristotle said something very, very similar about democracy during Greece's golden age. But this idea of government by Locke would make its way to the New World. And there were people who were using his words to draw up governments, compacts, agreements. We talked about the Mayflower Compact, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When Connecticut was formed, it was done in a much different way. But again, Locke, for all of his humanism, all of his secularism, was religious. He said and suggested and said that faith is a personal choice that does not fall under the government's responsibility. Our ideas around the very purposeful and intentional separation of church and state are based in part on Locke's philosophies. He called it a wall of separation, and the very concept of separation of church and state is standard here in the United States. Locke, again, very much ahead of his time in terms of philosophy, but again, that did not apply to black people. Again, he failed to practice what he preached when it came to slavery. We talked about it before. If you deny someone the full measure of humanity, you can justify anything. That's why you don't do that. Anyway, Locke, again, obviously influenced other great thinkers and writers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and of course Thomas Jefferson. Our last lesson is going to be kind of hard, but because you are children of the pandemic, you're going to have a unique view on this that generations before you did not. It is a testament to what can happen when fear overrides reason. A whole lot of bad things can happen. We're going to talk about the Salem witch trials. They happened in 1692. You'll remember Salem was the base of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, came 1630, 10 years after the Pilgrims. And it was a sort of an abandoned fishing village, but they set up the Massachusetts colony with Salem as its de facto capital. Again, 1630, remember John Winthrop bringing 700 Puritans to settle Salem? Well, this episode started in really in the winter of in 1691. There were two young girls named 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams. They were cousins, and they were listening to forbidden stories about witchcraft and magic. Puritan children, they were not even allowed to have toys because the Puritans were so uptight that they thought that Puritan work ethic simply did not allow for playfulness even from their children. Children were expected to read the Bible, to do their studies, and to be seen and not heard, basically. So, they were told these stories by a servant girl, probably someone who came from South America, but it was a servant, a slave, named Tituba. She told them stories about voodoo, magic, and whatnot. Again, just some of the oral tradition stories that I'm sure she learned in her childhood. And of course, to the girls 9 and 11, these were fascinating stories, I'm sure. They began inviting their friends to listen to these stories that Tituba, the servant girl, was telling them. Well, in January of 1692, Betty and Abigail began to show some very strange behaviors. They would scream, they had convulsions, they would hide under furniture, they would go into trance-like spells, and soon other girls that they had invited over were having these same kinds of physical symptoms. 7 girls in all had these symptoms, and the town's doctor examined the girls and concluded that they were bewitched. Okay. Well, the girls were sort of seen as innocent at that point, but they began accusing other women of exposing them to this bewitching. They named Tituba, the servant girl, but they also named 2 other women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, who were middle-aged homeless women. They were not very popular in Salem, and so the girls obviously said, well, nobody likes them anyway, maybe we can pawn this off on them. Tituba eventually confessed to teaching them the stories about witchcraft and whatnot. And she claimed also, while she was being really tortured, that there were other witches in Salem. Well, fear started gripping everything. People started looking at neighbors suspiciously, pointing fingers. And it was a social mess. You're starting to hear some parallels with the pandemic. Just saying. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter was put into prison. Okay? That's how bad it got. Lest anyone be bewitched or have the taint of the witch on them. It led to absolute madness, social madness. 150 men and women in Salem and nearby towns were accused and arrested for witchcraft, wizardry. A special court was set up called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which means to hear and to determine. No one got a lawyer. Again, this is before we really codified what legal rights you have as a defendant here in this new world, because it was not a nation, per se, then. Oddly enough, Sarah Good, who claimed to be innocent, was sentenced to hang. Tituba, who admitted guilt, was just thrown out of the community. A local preacher really fanned the flames. His name was Cotton Mather. He was greatly respected, and every one of his sermons after this had to do with witchcraft and the danger. Again, fueling fear, uncertainty, fear, more fear. The court, when they heard from the witnesses, accepted what they called spectral evidence. That is to say, I saw a ghost do this, or evidence that could not be, and it was perfectly admissible in court. Spectral evidence convicted a lot of people. Soon, they started blaming any injury, illness, or bad luck on witchcraft. Nearly everyone accused claimed innocence, but as it turned out, depending upon whose stories you accept as part of the Salem witch trials, 13 women and 6 men were killed. 4 more died in prison while awaiting trial or during their trial. After the last trial was abandoned, the court was dissolved. A law was eventually passed in Massachusetts stating that spectral evidence could no longer be used in court. Well, thank God. As for the 7 girls who had supposedly been afflicted, only one would make a public apology in the years to come. She confessed to a church congregation that she had been deluded by Satan and kept this going. Now, again, as for the fits the girls were having, it could have been a number of things. Again, sanitation was not a big deal at this time. Food poisoning, fungus around the eyes, a whole lot of things that it could have been. One thing it was not was witchcraft. But in the end, 20 people killed and a whole town driven to social madness because of one thing, fear. And they allowed it to infect their society, and it turned deadly. And unfortunately, I don't think we're very far removed from them socially, as the pandemic pointed out to us last couple of years. We will talk more about this on Monday. Get ready.